Hi, my name is Katherine Maddox. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas and the Department of Anthropology. And today I'm going to be talking about my research and particularly a part of my research that focuses on the European migrant crisis and the effects it's had on the lives of Syrian exiles in Paris. So, today I'm going to start by sketching out the story of the European migrant crisis, giving a bit of background. Um, and then I'm going to describe the policies implemented by the European Union to respond to this crisis and how they've created a sort of refugee regime. I'm going to move from there to talk specifically about the rhetoric of this regime and of immigration in general, and particularly the crisis narrative that emerges. Then I'm going to conclude by focusing on my own research and the way that Syrian contributions to culture and to daily life in Paris can sort of resist the collapsing of this crisis narrative by reasserting their own stories. Before I get to that, though, I want to rewind a bit to an event that occurred in November of 2020. It was a protest organized by migrant groups or migrant support groups, as well as several dozen migrants in the center of Paris at a really symbolic square called the Place de la République. This square is where a lot of protests are held, and at the center of it, it features a really large statue of the Marianne, the symbol of liberty and the French Revolution. So it's incredibly symbolic and important for these reasons. On this night in particular, these groups, along with the migrants, set up dozens of tents in the square to protest the lack of housing for migrants who are awaiting asylum processing or other issues with their files. And under French law, these migrants should be entitled to a shelter if one is available. However, most of the time, they're told that there's just no room and that they're forced to sleep on the street. So, for this reason, these groups got together to try to draw attention to this issue. However, they were met with extreme force as police used tear gas and dispersal grenades to destroy the tents and to scatter the participants. These sorts of protests have been ongoing, in fact. There was one just a few weeks ago with a similar aim. And oftentimes, when migrants protest like this in France about their right for shelter, they actually create the opportunity for the city to respond, to bring buses, to take them to shelters, because it centralizes them in one location. It makes it very easy for the city to provide them with shelter for at least that one night. So the aim of these protests, as much as it is to raise awareness, is also just to get these migrants into shelters. However, recently, there have been a few instances where the response has been this sort of extreme level of violence. And it's gotten to the point where it gets covered quite frequently on the news. Part of what I want to do now is talk about how it is that we've ended up in this very hostile situation where just a somewhat peaceful protest about the right to a shelter draws out this kind of response. I also want to note here that these pictures we're looking at were taken by one of my Syrian interlocutors who was not part of the migrant group, but rather working as a journalist, capturing what was happening. And I'll return to this point at the end of the presentation because it kind of shows us how far some folks have come through this refugee regime. But in order to understand the response to these protests, we have to go back even further to this European migrant crisis that began in the spring of 2015. This is a time when we saw an extreme increase in the number of folks coming from Asia and Africa seeking asylum in Europe, crossing physically into the borders of Europe to declare asylum, which is one way that refugees can request safety under international law. Of course, a big part of what we saw that summer, in particular in 2015, was an increase in fatalities and violence in Syria, but there were lots of other conflicts and reasons that migrants from essentially all over the world have been coming to Europe lately. Another thing that we saw over that summer, of course, are striking images like these of refugees packed onto boats, walking along train tracks, sleeping rough in central cities, and in some really harrowing images, we saw many refugees lose their lives, including a young Alan Kurdi who washed up on the beach in Turkey and whose image went global. So right now I want to sort of specify some of the language that I'm using because I've used a few different terms already. The first one being the most obvious is migrant or immigrant. Generally, this is someone who makes a conscious decision to leave their home and move to a foreign country with the intention of settling there, and it's often for economic reasons. Migrant is a big category under which we have refugees. Refugees are those who have been forced to flee their home because of war, violence, or persecution, and often without warning. While many people fall under this category of refugee, which is determined by international law, there is a difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is someone who is seeking official international protection from dangers in their home country, but whose claim for refugee status hasn't yet been confirmed. So importantly, all asylum seekers will be refugees, but not all refugees necessarily seek asylum. Some refugees flee into neighboring countries like Lebanon that don't offer that asylum status and don't offer that support. Others don't seek that asylum status or seek that support because they intend to return to their home country. Now, what we see in Europe are mostly asylum seekers. That is, people who want to have the protection to stay in Europe, oftentimes to stay there indefinitely and build lives, or at least until it's safe for them to return home. Because these categories are somewhat disparate, they overlap, a term that I prefer to use when I talk about Syrians in France is exile. This is a much broader category that can include more than legally recognized refugees, and it also allows for a broader solidarity between, let's say, economic migrants and asylum seekers. I use this term as well because, as one of my interlocutors pointed out, when you say refugee, you just think violence and war, whereas exile suggests a being away from one's country that is generally more open and almost more understandable. So who exactly are these refugees that were coming to Europe at this time and do continue to come? Well, as I've said, a lot of them are Syrians. There's also quite a few coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Venezuela, and other countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. We see this huge uptick, which is noted on the screen, between 2014 and 2015, partially because of the entrance of Russia and Daesh or ISIS into the conflict in Syria, which drove a lot of Syrians out. As I said, it increased violence significantly, but also for a number of reasons. And in some ways, it becomes a perpetuating movement as more people see those taking the risk to try to make it to Europe. They are encouraged in some ways to do so, which is a real factor, a real part of this moment. Once refugees or asylum seekers arrive in Europe, they're not automatically granted asylum. Originally, many of them in the early days were able to make their way to different countries throughout Europe thanks to Schengen border policies that mean that the borders remain open throughout Europe. But since it's become harder, refugees are often obliged to declare asylum, to seek asylum in the country in which they arrive in Europe, those being oftentimes Spain, Greece, Italy. And from there, their paperwork is processed. While many don't receive approval for asylum, Syrians are quite privileged in some ways, and that they have an 85% success rate. And at times it's been much higher. For instance, in France for 2016, 2017, 2018, it was 95% or higher. This doesn't mean that you automatically get your papers sorted and everything works out. This process often takes 6 months to 1 year before you know if you're approved, and during that time, depending on which country you're in, you will have to support yourself. Of course, there are certain policies that have been put in place to discourage migration since this time and to try to better organize the migrants who are coming over that have made it even harder for people to get asylum in Europe. These include stronger border controls, both the borders between Europe and the rest of the world and inter-borders inside Europe. There was also a significant deal struck with Turkey to hold refugees, especially Syrian and Iraqi and Afghani refugees, in Turkey rather than let them just travel into Europe. And finally, a coordinated asylum policy was implemented that tried to strengthen efforts to register refugees where they arrived. This is part of, I mentioned this policy earlier, it's called the Dublin Convention. It states that within the EU, asylum seekers must request asylum in the country in which they arrive. So that means oftentimes Spain, Greece, and Italy, as I said, bear the largest burden when it comes to refugees at this point. So these measures were largely implemented by the end of 2016, but we've only started to see their effects really in 2019, and obviously 2020 with COVID has been a really unique moment, which is still sort of hard to track with respect to this stuff. I want to pause here to sort of pose some questions that I'd like you to think about. You can write down your answers, or you can just give it a bit of thought, because obviously there are other migration crises happening throughout the world right now. So what are some parallels between this European migrant crisis that I've just described and what has been happening at the US southern border? I know this is particularly relevant for a lot of us, especially those of us in Texas. So how have your students and maybe your teaching been affected by the rhetoric of immigration in recent years? These calls of crisis, inundation, large flows of migrants, all these sort of water metaphors that emerge. And then just personally, how do you feel about that immigration rhetoric I've identified that's been circulating recently? One of the mainstays of immigration rhetoric that we see is this narrative of crisis that I mentioned before. This is a way of defining certain events, sites, and moments that erases history and context, distracting from the fact that crises do not just happen, but are made, are products of history. Now, I do want to be clear, there certainly were exceptional or extraordinary aspects of the events of 2015 and 2016, but there were also a great many continuities with earlier periods of border enforcement and refugee reception in Europe. We can think back to the Kosovo crisis and the refugees from that, or the Rwandan genocide. Many refugees were resettled in Europe at that time. So this is nothing new for Europe, although the casting of it as something new allows for certain policies and measures to be taken, which, as I said, identify as this refugee regime. It expands sort of the bundle of governmental, political, and economic approaches that work to keep apartheid-like frameworks in place through a sort of securitization, a locking down, as well as the humanitarian projects that are greatly needed. One place we can see this really clearly is in recent years in the islands all around the Aegean Sea, the Greek islands that have taken on lots of refugees. And now, thanks to the border measures that I mentioned and the coordinated asylum policies, they're being held there in camps where they're often suffering from a lack of sanitation, a lack of food and water, clean water at times. And there have been some really devastating fires in recent years at these camps on islands throughout the Aegean. However, life in the islands itself carries on. I visited one of these islands and you have no clue that there's a refugee camp down the road. It's as if there's two lives happening in this one space that we call Europe. The refugees in their camps waiting for their fate, and then the rest of the Europeans living on. However, following this asylum process, it's logical to assume that some of those refugees will receive the right to resettle in European countries, at which point they'll start potentially on the process to European citizenship. And so it's worth noting that when you move from potentially a camp space where you're completely separate from society to the need to integrate and assimilate, there's going to be a lot of ground for you to cover. Another sort of snagging point in that journey is this concept of humanitarian need. Asylum seekers must present their life histories in particular ways to demonstrate that there's a well-founded fear of persecution they face back home, and that they're deserving and vulnerable and credible enough. As well, images of suffering refugee and migrant subjects aren't just sort of created and disseminated through these legal procedures that identify individuals as refugees, where they have to tell their story of suffering over and over again. But they're also present in the media and NGO reports. We saw them nearly every day from 2015 until maybe 2019. There were stories of migrant suffering in Europe. So, as a refugee coming to Europe, as I said, potentially looking to just start a new life here, you carry with you not just the baggage of having to leave your country, the dispossession and displacement, but also this baggage of being a real victim. It makes what Hannah Arendt said in 1949 after World War II, when she herself was a refugee, really relevant here. If we are saved, we feel humiliated, and if we are helped, we feel degraded. So in the face of all this, I want to ask, how can we better understand the lives lived in the wake of crisis? How can we better understand the lives of these refugees who become asylum seekers and then are granted asylum in Europe? Before we do that, I want to ask again some questions to sort of frame the next section. Can we ever see refugees and asylum seekers as more than victims of crisis? I mean, I certainly hope the answer is yes, but it's a legitimate question. How do you connect with voices that are not like yours in your own teaching? And what does even understanding someone else's experience look like to you? So in order to start to answer some of those questions myself, I've embarked on this research project here in France with Syrian exiles. Syrians in France are a relatively small population, especially compared to other places that have resettled Syrians in larger numbers, such as Germany and even Sweden. There's only about 20 to 30,000 resettled Syrians, in addition to a population of about maybe 15,000 Syrian immigrants who were living in France before the war. I work with the community in Paris because it's slightly larger, because the French system is very centralized. So in Paris you have a lot of events and you do have more support, but there are Syrians throughout France. For example, many families have been resettled in the countryside and live lives very different than the interlocutors with whom I work. So I focus on this really centralized group in the largest city in France, and yet they're still a small group. So in order to conduct this research, I wasn't able to just go to a Syrian quarter or part of town. I really had to get to know people. I spent about 20 months conducting interviews, engaging participant observation, so basically attending events, talking with people, talking about my research with them. I went to lots of cultural events, lots of lectures. I spent lots of just everyday time with Syrian friends. I had lots of coffee, I ate lots of food, and lately I've been spending a lot of time on Facebook and WhatsApp because of COVID-19. And all of this was with the goal of really situating these lives, getting to know them. I should note here that I'm not Syrian, nor am I French, so the perspective I offer is as an outsider, essentially, looking for patterns that maybe are harder to see when you're inside of it. But I also am never able to fully express or even comprehend some of the experiences of trauma that my interlocutors have undergone. Now, again, I'm going to sort of explain what these terms are that I've already started to use. In particular, terms like resettlement or relocation have to do with the way that Syrians or refugees in general arrive in Europe. The first way of arriving, as I've already discussed, is through declaring asylum. And in order to declare asylum, you have to be on European territory. So you have to make your way all the way to France, which, as you can see here, is pretty far from Syria. While it does have a Mediterranean border, it's quite far north compared to Spain or Italy, so pretty hard to get to if you were going to go via North Africa, and incredibly difficult to get to over land, especially with the new border procedures. You have to cross through about a dozen countries and hope not to get stopped by police, at which time you would be forced to declare asylum there. So another way that Syrians have done this, declared asylum on French territory, is through legitimate visas. There are many Syrians who study in France, who even work in France, who have, since the revolution and the violence in Syria began, requested asylum because of a real fear that they wouldn't be able to return to Syria. There have even been sort of scholarship schemes set up by the French state after the revolution to bring students over, which then gives them the choice to request asylum or just complete their studies in France and return to Syria if they so choose. Now, this is common, but another really common way that Syrians end up in France is through resettlement efforts. These are attempts to take the most vulnerable refugees from countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, these neighboring countries of Syria, and bring them to France to essentially create a new life. In the past, this has looked like oftentimes minorities or younger people who are identified as better candidates for assimilation into French society. So often people who already have an advanced degree, professional skill set, maybe language skills. And then, as I said, religious minorities are another group that France has tended to privilege in terms of resettlement, thanks to support from various religious NGOs in the country who sort of take the reins in those efforts. I mentioned earlier that there are quite a few Syrian families who've been resettled in the countryside in France. These tend to be from these religious minority groups. Now, there's a third way that Syrians end up in France. It's less common. It's through relocation from other EU countries. Basically, as I mentioned before, Greece, Italy, Spain. In recent years, with the tightening border regime, they have borne the brunt of this sort of migration increase, and they don't really have the resources to support it, as they're some of the poorer countries within the European Union. As such, Northern European countries in particular have pledged to take some refugees from these Southern European countries. However, the quotas have yet to be met. Although France is a large sponsor of this effort, they themselves have still not taken on the amount of refugees from the South that they've said they would. So, what happens once you're a Syrian who arrives in France? Well, there's a lot of technical details that I won't get into too much here, but essentially you're kind of on your own unless you've been resettled with an NGO that can sponsor you. And even then it's quite lonely. So one of the first things that people do once they arrive in France is reach out to other Syrians, friends of friends, anyone they know. And this serves to sort of construct a type of diaspora. As I mentioned before, we don't have a very significant spatial presence in terms of neighborhoods that are identified as Syrians or Syrian, or even lots of Syrian restaurants. But instead you have events, gatherings, and even networks, friends of friends who will help each other out when they're looking for an apartment, that serve to create these diasporic ties. In the first years in particular for the Syrian exiles with whom I work, that's when they tend to try to connect the most with other Syrians as they're trying to figure things out, because there isn't much support on the ground. There's a lot of different options. Once you get your asylum, you get a small amount of support from the state, but in terms of finding a job, it's incredibly difficult due to unemployment, and language is really tricky. As a refugee, as an asylum seeker in France, you are entitled to a certain number of language classes, but it's by no means sufficient to learn the language or to get a job working in it. And so at first people really rely on the other Syrians they know in France and Paris to help them figure out how to navigate this. After that, there tends to be a bit more of an effort to reach out. Sometimes this is called integration, sometimes this is called assimilation, but I prefer the term insertion because it suggests the insertion of Syrian culture and Syrian lives into France, the addition of their experiences rather than the changing, modifying of their lives to fit with France. There are quite a few events that serve to connect Syria to France. They've obviously been put on hold in the past year, but there used to be always this 3 to 4 day cultural festival that would bring together Syrian musicians, intellectuals, even chefs, to lead workshops, to give talks, even to dance and to sing, to perform. And importantly here, this wasn't just geared to bring together Syrians, but also to expose interested French people or others to Syrian culture. The point was to sort of look outward a bit. In a similar way, some friends of mine have organized hiking groups as a way to get Syrians, French, and other people to mingle, to talk. They started this out as an effort to kind of mix their friend groups through parties, and they realized that people just ended up on other sides of the room, hanging out with the people they know. So they thought it would be a good way to get people to talk, to make them do an activity together. These are really significant as I identify them here, these efforts, because they're all about opening up French culture to taking in a bit of Syrianness, and not necessarily just creating a Syrian bubble in Paris. There's also unique platforms that have been offered to artists in particular due to the Syrian conflict, due to the revolution in Syria. It's somewhat limited, but support for Syrian art, for Syrian plays, has been on the rise in Europe in general in recent years, and France in particular has sponsored artists, has sponsored playwrights, has sponsored musicians, poets, with government funding, as also with platforms and interest. So this is another way that we see Syrians sort of making their presence known, contributing to public discourse about migration, is through the register of art. Now, I want to be clear, it's not to say that Syrian exiles are resisting this sort of victimhood narrative of crisis simply by existing, but it's through these everyday efforts to sort of make experiences of displacement and exile legible to the French state, to the public, and also to each other, that Syrians challenge sort of simplistic notions of immigrants and refugees. And this is exactly what I tried to pay attention to in my research, but I want to argue we can pay attention to even in our daily engagement with tricky topics such as migration crisis. One instance where we really see this insertion of a Syrian perspective into life in France is in the protests that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. Syrian exiles have participated in various protests over the past 2 years against police violence and in support of migrants and asylum seekers. One in particular was the Syrian photographer featured here, Amir Al-Helbi. He was actually beaten up and had his camera broken by a police officer, and when he shared images of himself after that protest, the images went viral, and he was interviewed by a number of large media platforms in France. And what's interesting is what they choose to feature, and what he said in his interview is that he essentially had lived through something similar in Aleppo. Now, we could choose to see this as a way in which he's casting himself as the victim. I was a victim in Aleppo, and I was a victim in France. However, here, I actually think it's interesting that he's drawing this connection. You know, I mentioned that the notion of crisis creates a rupture where we can't engage with the past. But through the way he's portrayed his experience in France, he's noting that there's a connection here between his life in Syria and his life in France. The two things aren't separated. He's not just this nameless, faceless victim, but he's somebody who has experiences that he can share. So essentially, to conclude, this talk has just been all about complicating narratives and complicating stories. And I would say that the thing I'd like us all to take away from it is, whenever possible, privileging the narratives of refugees and exiles when we tell the story of migrant crisis can at least allow us to re-engage with the people at the center of it. It's not a perfect solution, and it doesn't necessarily answer all the world's problems, but it's a way we can shift our perspective through paying attention to the voices that we're getting and sort of get beyond the facts on the ground and the figures as they were, to see what's actually happening here, to redraw these lines of connections and to understand how these crises happen, but how they might happen again. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to your questions and your feedback in the Q&A